Have you ever been telling a story about yourself and you start to pick up on cues that the person you're talking to isn't really paying close attention to you, or that maybe they're not all that interested in the story that you're telling? This has happened as somebody who's quite chatty, happened to me through the years. So that over time, I have developed some techniques to help gauge whether to keep talking or how much to talk. Like just a couple days ago, I was with some pastor friends, and we hadn't been together all summer, and so we just start catching up on what we'd been doing through the summer so far. And as I was sharing, I started in on a story about our time in Quebec City, and I kind of paused, and they could see it, and I said, I'm trying to decide whether to give you the long version or the short version. And one of the guys said, we're not in a hurry, give us the long one. And so I did. And they were engaged in the story that I was telling. Like in that moment, right, I gave them a choice. I let them tell me how interested they were in the more detailed version of the story, because not everyone's always interested in the full details. But often I actually make the choice for the person. And I usually start with the short version. I have a lot of stories, and some of them are really important to me because they actually say something about who I am. They say something about what's important to me. And so I could go on and on talking about how I became a Christian, or how I became a pastor, how I became the pastor of Discovery, how Jane and I met, how my parents got divorced, what I was like in high school, right? I could go on and on about any of these, but I recognize that not everybody is all that interested in who I am or how I came to be the way that I am, and that's totally fine. It really is. So I have short versions of all of these stories for small talk. When someone asks how Jane and I met, we actually tell the story in really similar ways. We met up in a small town outside of Seattle. She was in her first teaching job. I was doing an internship, and Jane's roommate was my boss. And sometimes, that's enough. The conversation moves on, new question, new topic. But sometimes we tell just that, and the person's curious about some detail of that short version, right? They pick up on, small town, or Seattle, or they hear that Jane's a teacher, or that I was doing an internship, or they think it's interesting that her roommate was my boss, and so they ask a follow-up question, and there I let their questions tell me whether to share more or whether to share anything else at all. I don't know where I kind of picked up this technique, but it's started to serve me well. It's kept me from, most of the time, going on and on with people who just aren't interested. The reason I bring this up is because Mark, the author of our passage this morning, seems to know this technique. He could have said infinitely more, but he liberally uses this technique throughout the gospel. And so we read Mark chapter 14. We read a good chunk of it this morning. And in verse 26, Mark writes this. He says, when they sung a hymn, doesn't tell us which one, and they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Simple story. Straightforward details. And if you're bored or disinterested or just really not invested in understanding what's happening, you just keep reading. But the person who has ears to hear, right, the person who has a soft heart with some spiritual roots that are growing deep, the person who is listening attentively and noticing, who wants to understand what all this means, they've got questions for Mark after this short story. For instance, where is it written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered? And what does it mean? It's interesting. Mark doesn't assume anyone wants to hear all the background information, the background stories behind Jesus dying on the cross. Mark just doesn't assume that anyone cares enough about the story to actually try to understand what it means. So he just tells the short version of it. Jesus is betrayed, he suffered, and he was crucified. A couple general details sprinkled in, but it's simple, it's succinct, but enough details to prompt the curious person to ask more questions, to seek more of the story. Jesus gave up his life. But why? What does it all mean? It's only in the background stories that Mark alludes to that we can begin to answer that question for us. And here with Jesus' quote, Mark leads us back to the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Zechariah is where that comes from. Zechariah has a lot to say about shepherds and sheep. He says, the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted for lack of a shepherd. Throughout the First Testament, and especially the prophets, leaders of the people, leaders like kings and leaders like priests and the elders, they were the ones who were referred to as shepherds. And here Zechariah tells us that the people are lost. Like, they wander aimlessly. And sheep are such a great image of this, right? Because you can just sort of picture sheep just like, not really sure where to go, sort of making their way wherever. They don't know how to live well. They don't know what to do with their lives because, Zechariah says, they don't have a leader. They don't have a shepherd. They have no one to guide them, no one to follow. And in the next verse, Zechariah, he gives us actually a little bit more context. He says this, he quotes God saying, "My anger is hot against the shepherds, and I will punish the leaders, for Yahweh of hosts cares for his flock, the house of Judah." So we notice, right? It's actually not true that the people don't have a leader. They have human leaders. It's just that they suck. They're very bad. They're corrupt. They're oppressive. They're self-centered. They're lazy. They're all of the worst things that leaders can be. And they make God angry because all of these things that they are is hurting people. And so they are not to be followed. But then also notice, Yahweh cares for his flock. The people do have a leader. They do have a shepherd in their God. But the implication is that they wander because they don't trust him. They wander because they don't know his voice. They don't follow his lead. The people lack a shepherd, not because God is not with them, but because they don't listen to his voice. They don't submit to God as their shepherd, and so they wander. I mean, you can take this idea, this image, right, of bad human shepherds leading people astray, and you can go back through the whole Gospel of Mark, this gospel that we've been reading together for the last several weeks, and you'll see it everywhere. The chief priests, the scribes, the elders are often portrayed as corrupt, often greedy for power, and they do not serve the people. The people are not living, they're not thriving because of the leaders. And so in the Gospel of Mark, the people are described as lost because their human leaders are failing them. And at the same time, they don't follow God's voice. So, what does God do when human leaders fall short and when people won't listen for his voice? Zechariah tells us exactly what God says. God says this, I will strengthen them, my people, right? I will save them. I will bring them back because I have compassion on them. For I am Yahweh, their God, and will answer them. I love this image of God. I will whistle for them and gather them in. For I have redeemed them. I will bring them home and gather them. I will make them strong in Yahweh, and they shall walk in his name. the language is all shepherd language, right? God will strengthen and save, and he'll whistle for them, and he'll gather them, and God will redeem his people. He will answer them because even if they don't trust him, God declares, I will be their God. I mean, some of these passages are so incredibly powerful, right? Like in your life, if you've ever wondered if God is really committed to you, like if you've ever wondered if your sin, if your failures could ever somehow disqualify you from God's love, from his commitment to you, just read the story of Israel. Like, see and hear God's story, God's commitment to his rebellious people, and you will know that this is how committed God is to you, to us. You don't have to worry or fear whether God is for you, whether there is anything that could ever separate you from God's love in Christ Jesus. God will be the shepherd to his people even when they won't be his sheep. So what does this look like for God to then shepherd his people? In Zechariah's day, it looks like chapter 11, verse 4 of Zechariah. It should be up there. So, thus said Yahweh, my God. He's telling Zechariah, Zechariah, become shepherd of this flock that's doomed to slaughter. So what does God do to shepherd his people? He asks the prophet Zechariah to step in and take over from the bad humans. God raises up a new human shepherd where the old ones failed. And Zechariah, he actually accepts the call. In verse 7, we hear Zechariah say, so I became the shepherd of the flock, doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. And I tended the sheep, and everyone lived happily ever after. I already see heads shaking. No, we know how these stories go, right? Not so much. Because Zechariah next says in verse 8, in 1 month, I destroyed the 3 shepherds. So picture what Zechariah has done. Zechariah has come in, and he's either killed, eliminated, or somehow gotten rid of the 3 leaders who were causing all of the problems for God's people. Destroyed is pretty violent language in the Bible. And so the impression is that Zechariah has come in like sword swinging. And he's accomplished a lot in a month. And now that the bad shepherds are out of the way, Zechariah can start the real shepherding work. But it turns out taking out God's enemies is not the same thing as leading God's people. And in the very next breath, after he says, I tended the sheep and then I destroyed the 3 shepherds, Zechariah quits shepherding. He says, but I became impatient with the sheep, and they also detested me. So I said, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. He's really done. Zechariah dusts off his feet, wipes off his hands, and he quits 1 month in. You ever wanted to quit a job 1 month in? It's got to be pretty bad, right? That quick. It's amazing. Zechariah is more than ready to rise up to violence. Sign me up for that. But pastoral care, he just doesn't have the stomach for that. Pastoral, pastor, you know that this word is related to the word shepherd. Although, in our language, pastor and shepherd, have become two distinct words in English. Like they come from the same source, the same root. To pastor is to shepherd is to pastor. And I don't know if you know this, but like pastors regularly report some of the highest levels of anxiety and depression or burnout, and like quit rates are as high as any other stressful profession. Right now, there are actually all sorts of groups that are studying pastoral health as they try to see what impact COVID has had, and just the last few years in general, on pastors, and it's generally not looking good. At first, researchers thought pastors were going to come out okay. Large numbers of pastors were actually staying in their roles, but it turns out that a lot of pastors were just working really hard to hold it all together and have begun to fall apart. And almost once a week, I hear of another friend or colleague sort of in my network, somebody leaving ministry for good. While there are definitely seasons of life in ministry like this last one that are harder than others, Zechariah does something historically for us, right? Zechariah reminds us that pastoring people has always been hard work. Caring for stubborn people, being patient with impatient people, like sometimes doing all of that for people who detest you, like that can be rough. But on top of the challenges that come with caring for people is the inescapable fact that the pastor is also a person. And so human pastors are prone to the same stubbornness and the same impatience as the people they shepherd. And human pastors are tempted to detest the very people they've been called to care for. You can hear that in Zechariah a little bit. I'm done with you, is what he says. When God raises up Zechariah as a shepherd, it's just one more reminder that human shepherds just won't do. Human shepherds are never going to be enough. They're too selfish, too quick to pick up the sword. What we need, what we have always needed, what the Hebrew scriptures have always been pointing us towards is our need for God. God, our shepherd, to take on human flesh, to become human like us in order to shepherd us as one of us. This is what we have always needed and longed for. And the Gospel of Mark is telling this exact story. This has happened in Jesus. That the God of Israel, that the creator of the heavens and the earth has come to us in the flesh. And he comes to us to feed us until we are satisfied. And he comes to us to teach us how to live well. And he comes to us to heal us and to restore our lives. And he comes to us that we might be free from sin and death and the devil. But Jesus, the Good Shepherd, says to his disciples, "You will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." Jesus comes as a shepherd, unlike any shepherd humanity has ever seen, right? Human shepherds are consistently selfish. Human shepherds constantly take up our swords. Human shepherds will fight to the death or they'll quit when it all becomes too much. But Zechariah tells the story of another kind of shepherd who will come, one who will come to shepherd God's people with the spirit of grace, So that rather than strike down all the bad shepherds with a sword, Jesus would let those shepherds, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, strike him down. And rather than quit when the people are stubborn and impatient and when they detest him, Jesus announces that he will suffer and die for them. He will look like a complete failure, right? Like knowing that when he does, when he gives up his life, when he lets them strike him down, that the sheep will all scatter. Like they will abandon him, right? The disciples, Peter names it, they're ready to take up swords. They are ready to risk death to fight for a powerful shepherd who will rule. They are not ready to stick with a suffering shepherd who looks weak in the world's eyes. Our temptation will always be to abandon Jesus whenever he looks weak. Whenever he's not showing up with the kind of power that we expect him to, when he's not doing what we need him to do for us in this moment. And yet, Jesus promises, when I am dead and buried, when I am at my very weakest, there it is. In that place, I will rise and I will lead you. Zechariah anticipated this, telling us that there is something about, he didn't have Jesus' name, but there is something about this suffering shepherd, something about Jesus and his death, something that will finally open people's eyes and open their hearts, something that will cause the people to call on God's name when they see Jesus crucified, that will cause the people to see, to hear God declare, these are my people. And Zechariah tells us, believing that we are God's people, we will say, Yahweh is my God. And so at the very end of the story, it shouldn't surprise us when a foreign soldier who is far from Yahweh sees Jesus on the cross. They see him beaten and they see him brutalized. They see him slaughtered by the people he came to love. And the soldier hears Jesus praying from the cross, and he hears Jesus' final cry from the cross, and he witnesses Jesus' final breath. He sees all of the horror that has been done to Jesus, and yet he sees with eyes that are open who this man is, and he declares, truly, this man is the Son of God. He's the first in the entire Gospel of Mark to see the truth, and he sees it in Jesus on the cross. And so, I wonder today, like if we can see in the crucified Jesus, our shepherd, who leads to life. Can we hear his voice, and will we let him lead us? Here's why this question is so important, because where is he leading us? He will say, take up your cross and follow me. The path that Jesus walks, the suffering of our shepherd is an invitation to imitate and walk in the same way as we give our lives away for our neighbors, the stranger, for our enemies, those who might detest us.